standing over there, but oh. Good evening, my name is Tom Barry. I'm the pastor here at Bethany Presbyterian Church, and on behalf of our congregation, I'd just like to welcome you all here. This is, I think you all know that dealing with and figuring out the best way to move forward with the issue and the best way, I guess, for the unsheltered is a complicated question and a complicated process. And no matter where you fall on this, whether either side or right in the middle, you are welcome here, and I hope you learn things here. I only request that as we move forward, we do that seeking clarity in ways that are respectful and helpful. So, Doug, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom. And Tom, thank you for letting us meet here, and this is our third meeting here, and we really appreciate how convenient you made this for us and how easy it's been. So happy to be here. We really appreciate that. So my name is Doug Walker. Welcome. Some of you I know, half of you I know, and half of you are new faces. I'm part of the All Care. I'm a volunteer for the All Care Community Foundation, and we've sort of been asked by the city to be involved in the effort to find a solution for the homeless problem we have in town. And so we've been working on this for about 6-9 months now. To start off our conversation, I'm going to ask Sam to come up here. Sam's another volunteer with the All Care Foundation. He's going to talk a little bit about what's going on within the city and the various efforts, not just this particular one about urban campground, but other various efforts that are going on. If you don't mind, Sam. Go ahead. I think something else to say.
Hi. So I think one of the things that comes up in a lot of the conversations is a question about either what the program is or what it's going to do, what it's not going to do. And so one of the places that I want to address that is how the program is going to work with other programs and how it's getting developed right now in the city. So over the last couple of years, we've worked to open up Foundry Village, which is a great transitional housing program. Many of these people are fairly stable when they come in. They have time to get their feet under them, move through a case management process, step out of homelessness or transitional housing into more stable forms of housing. The program's working well. The units are all full. We have very few problems on site, and we'd like to see that continue. One of the barriers that Rover Tree's running into is that as folks are coming in, a lot of people have been chronically homeless for a long time. And it is a difficult thing to share a kitchen with 17 other people. Just for any one of us, that's a skill you have to learn. And so what we would like to do is develop a campground as a place where people can come off the streets, stabilize, get tied into case management, get tied into things like organ health plan and SNAP and other community benefits that they would be eligible for that will help them make those steps. Get reconnected with friends and family, redevelop their social support network while they're waiting for a room to open at somewhere like Foundry Village, or if they're eligible, they go to the Gospel Rescue Mission. If they're a good candidate, maybe they would be able to go into one of the other programs in town too. They all have different eligibility requirements. While we're working on these pieces, we're also looking at Project Turnkey. If you heard about that program last year, there's some funds set aside to purchase hotels and motels around the state. I got to go down and visit the first one of those that was awarded this morning. It's in Ashland. It's called Options for Helping Residents of Ashland, or ORA. They are doing a lot of social services and case management services right there in the building, as well as offering this really multi-family housing in a conditioned hotel, reconditioned hotel.
Could I have you use the microphone because we're not coming through well on the live stream?
Yeah, how's that? Oh, perfect, thank you. Sorry, I forgot we were live streaming. So that would be a place for people to transition to out of Foundry Village, which answers that question. If it's in transitional housing, where do people transition to? And then we're looking at a program in Cave Junction that would help address some of the needs that are in Cave Junction, further out in the county, and start really trying to build out what they call a housing pipeline. So somebody's homeless, street outreach, connecting to services, come into the lowest level of service that somebody's eligible for, like the campground, and then kind of keep making these steps up to independence and recognizing that not everybody is going to be independent. Some folks physically aren't able to live on their own, senior citizens, folks that have physical disabilities and may need additional care later, skilled nursing facility or some sort of other housing with supports. A lot of times those are referred to as permanent supportive housing. There's already some of that in Grants Pass and Josephine County, and we'd like to try and expand that too, so that we can really try and, using some of the language that I see out on social media, it's both a hand out and a hand up, or a step up, so that people get the exact service that they need when they need it, meeting them where they're at, and then giving them opportunities to continue advancing out towards independence. And that's kind of really the whole thing in a nutshell. I'm happy to try and answer any questions or pass it back to Doug. Okay?
Thanks, Sam. One of the things Sam missed, not to point the finger at you, but we've been running, not we, but Rogue Retreat's been running a shelter for 4 months now, and they've got 2 months to go, or another month to go, something like that, over at the hospital.
15th.
June 15th. The expiration on that is June 15th. And there's some effort underway to try to keep that open. It's over near the hospital in Ramsey, serving about 20-something people. It's at full capacity. And I think I've not heard any problems with it. So I think that's going well and whatnot. So what we've been trying to do, the All Care Foundation's been trying to do, is trying to build some awareness about what a campground is, trying to figure out what we might be able to propose to the city for the general design, and some of that is dictated by what different physical sites we look at, what's available there, what's not available. And so I'm going to go into a little bit of a slideshow to help me move through some of this stuff to talk about it. So what we've been doing is sort of using the model that's been going on in Medford for about a year and a half now with Rogue Retreat and what they've been doing. They created their campground after the fires a year and a half or so ago. The city asked them if they would create a campground, and so they found some land they were able to lease, and then they started developing a campground. Drug and alcohol counseling, mental health issues, housing, job readiness, legal aid. There's a lot of money that gets saved by having them all in one spot, all of the people that may be unhoused or need those services in one spot, and they're able to both reach those people with services, but also provide more thorough services that way. It is a safe space there at the Urban Campground in Medford. Most everyone there is there by referral through the police livability team, they're called. And we have a similar situation here, and ours is called the community response team. And there is initial conversations with them that they will be the referring agency for people that come into the campground. The other thing that's significant to note that in Medford, the site is secured, fenced, and it's also gated at night so that there aren't people that can just come in at any time. They have to come in. I don't know what the hours are down there, but they lock the gate up at night. And they have paid staff. In conversations with Rogue Retreat, they can put 2 staff there 24 hours a day, and that will handle roughly 70 sites, which at max capacity, if there's 2 people in each site, that would be 140 people, and that's what 2 people, 24 hours a day, caseworkers, 24 hours a day can handle here in Grants Pass. Hygiene there in Medford, because it's a temporary facility, is porta potties, and they don't have water from the city, so they bring in water with a water truck there in Medford. Hopefully, if we find a space here in town, we can have city water and city sewer. Food is brought in. I think they get 1 meal a day from various nonprofits, churches, and everything. Bring meals in to the facilities in Medford. And we've had conversation with various entities, organizations here in town, churches that are willing to do the same thing here. That is not showing up there, is it? I did not realize that's not showing up there. Sorry about that. I thought you were looking at what I was looking at. this is a bit, if you can see it or not from back there, that's a bit of what it looks like in Medford. There are basically, I think those are car-covered canvas top carports in rows, and the tent areas, the tents are right underneath those. Each participant is given roughly a 10-foot by 10-foot area, and they have to maintain it and keep it clean. One of the struggles that they've had, that they've learned, some of the lessons they've learned is to really clamp down on what the homeless people or the participants might bring into the site, because they tend to, when they start to become stable and have a place to keep things, they tend to bring lots of things in. Kind of like my garage gets filled up with stuff. Same thing there. And so they have to find that balance between, yeah, you want to improve your life and have things, we understand that, to a participant, but you can't keep bringing in more and more stuff. One of the funnier stories somebody tells is that Justin, I think his name is, one of the managers down there. He's driving into work and he sees somebody stand up a mattress, king-size mattress on the side of the road, and is there for 2 or 3 days, and then suddenly he sees one of the participants dragging it into the village because they want to put it in their tent. And he said, nope, can't have that here. So you make them get rid of that king-size mattress. One of the other things there in Medford are the pallet shelters. We happen to have, I think we have 20 or 25 of those that were purchased by UCAN for our area. They're in storage right now waiting to be used. I don't know if you can see these very well, little square boxes. They're made up in the Portland area somewhere. They're sort of made for emergency shelters, but we have about 25 or so, and we intend to put them up on the site there. And the way it works in Medford, from what I understand, it's been a while since I've talked to them, it's been a couple months, but they transition people from the tents to these as they get more accustomed to things and they're able to follow rules and they're able to do what they need to do. So it's sort of a reward to get into the more permanent pallet shelters. So following the rules. So the people there at the facility in Medford, as well as here in Grants Pass, will have to follow the campground rules. They'll have to leave if they don't. Road retreat campground participants are required to engage with community support specialists and take steps towards addressing the barriers stopping them from re-engaging in society. Using drugs or alcohol and possession of paraphernalia is forbidden while inside of the campground or any of the shelters there. That's one of the things I think that's important here is what we're trying to create here is a facility that transitions people out of homelessness into permanent housing somewhere, somehow. It's not just to house them, it's not just to get them off the street, but it's to help them restore their lives. And not everybody has the same, that's not going to be the same for everybody. Like Sam said earlier, there are some people in the facility in Medford that have significant mental health issues, disabilities. They're always going to be in some kind of a service like this. They're never going to be homeowners or rent an apartment in a nice neighborhood. That's just the way it is. But most people move on up and move out and do better. Rogue Retreats, overall success rate is about 60%. 60% of their participants move through their system and graduate out into permanent housing somewhere. And then the benefits to this kind of a facility, instead of living in an environment not meant for human habitation, people are given their own tent, lockable storage container for important documents and belongings. They get to use the porta potties, hot meals, medical support. Most of the staff have had their own troubled pasts and provide excellent peer support and trusted communications with guests in the campground. When people can stay in one central location, it's easier to have sustained case management, and results show a higher increase of success on the continuum to homelessness. So what can you do? You can educate yourself about facts, about what's being proposed and what works, what's working in Medford, what's working in some of the other towns. You can talk with friends and families and neighbors about this. You can let local politicians know about your opinions, whether you're in favor of something like this or not in favor of something, or you want some action of some sorts. There tends to be a lot of conversation about this and not a lot of action. And then, if you're willing, be ready to volunteer when it's time to either build something or staff it with volunteers and staff. And that is it for my slideshow.
Doug?
Yes?
You mentioned that a lot of people get there by referral, often by the police. What makes one person qualified to be referred to the campground and someone else not qualified?
Well, as I understand, the police in Medford, which is your is doing this. Yeah, the police in Medford have a general relationship and a knowledge of the person they're talking to, and they know they're ready to be in the campground, or they're ready to move to something else, or they know their criminal background. And so those that are predatory or have violent behavior in their background aren't referred into the campgrounds. They continue to live in the blackberry bushes or wherever they live. That's how that works. And I'm assuming our police force would do the same thing. And then there's also, our community response teams has an embedded options professional case management. I don't know what their title is. I don't know if they're psychiatrists or what they are. But they're embedded in the team that goes around and talks to people. And then there's other agencies that would refer as well. Any other questions on that? Where we are in the process right now, the city has given us some guidelines about where an appropriate piece of property would be, distance from schools, distance from daycare, distance from public parks. And so we're trying to find locations that are far enough away from those things to meet those criteria, and then to look to see what piece of properties are fit for sale. Are they appropriately zoned? Are they priced appropriately? Flat, sewer, water services, so they can be developed, so we can get a bathroom building, shower building built. So we're in the process of going through those. Are they in neighborhood? We proposed 2 different sites in the past, one on N Street, and then one in on the Redwood Avenue area, and both of those, we've got a lot of neighborhood feedback that wasn't appropriate, and so we're trying to shift our focus to more industrial zones, but that brings other complications in. So currently we're looking at some industrial zones, and then at the very north end of town, and then we've also had some contact with the Oregon Youth Authority. They have some vacant land behind their youth prison. It's really hard, it's not very doable, but it's in a pinch, we could probably make that work if we couldn't find anything else. So we're in conversation with various property owners, and then as well as OYA, talk about their property. And then right now we're still, that's still where we're at. We're still just talking and exploring things. Any other questions? Good crowd, yeah.
So, here we are. I mean, it's a lot smaller group than we were, certainly the first one and the last one. But you're carrying this load, we all care, Community Foundation. I keep feeling like instead of being against having a campground, our community really does need to step up and embrace the need for it, the dire need for it. And I'm not sure whether anybody has a suggestion or agreeing with me. I think that I've heard over and over about how much it's going to cost and the tax ramifications. I know that both of you have responses, factual responses, actually. I also know that people have oftentimes said they just need to get a job. You know, get off their buns and get a job. But the truth be told, what kind of job? And if you haven't showered for weeks, if you don't have clothes, if you are mentally ill, no, I should say you have a mental illness, not that you are mentally ill. Having a stepson who suffers from schizophrenia. And I don't believe anything's going to happen, but something could really marvelously happen, miraculously happen, community happen, make it happen, if we got behind it.
Yeah.
Because homelessness and problems are not going to go away.
Yeah. So you brought up a few points. I'll try to remember them all. As for the community supporting, not supporting some sort of solution, I think most of the community supports some kind of solution. what that is, there's debate. And then there's certainly been a lot of resistance to it being in one person's neighborhood versus another, and that's understandable. Scares some people. But I think most of the community is wanting something done. It's what that something is, and at some point, I think we'll land on a compromise somewhere, and we'll move forward. As for the cost to the community, the All Care Health reimburses Foundry Village for the people that stay there, and they end up doing the same thing at the other campground in Medford, or they would do it here because it actually saves Medicare, Medicaid money when a homeless person is in a facility. So there's actually a savings to our whole system. And I would imagine the hospital would say the same thing, that it would save them money when people are housed and they have case management around them and they're able to see a doctor once in a while. I would suspect that our city parks would say the same thing, that they would be able to save money if they weren't dealing with the homeless people in the parks, and probably the police. But a lot of that, the police don't factor in what things cost, because that's just not the way they deal with things. I don't remember what else you might have talked about.
Well, getting jobs.
Oh, jobs, yeah.
Having,
Yeah.
that's the in my backyard.
Yeah, so a good story with that. Sam actually works for All Care Health as well as a volunteer with the All Care Foundation, and they were having the hillside behind their buildings weed whacked a couple weeks ago, and I was there, and Sam said there's a gentleman that lives up there in a tent, and he's got a big sign on the tent, and the people that were hired to weed whack told them, and the sign on the tent said, "Please don't remove my stuff. This is the only place I can live. I'm at work right now. I'll be back at 4 o'clock, and I'll move it if you need me to. But please don't wreck my stuff or destroy it." And most of the people at Foundry Village who were homeless that are now at Foundry Village have jobs, and those that don't have jobs are on disability or are too old to work. So most of the people have jobs. That goes to the job thing, and the homelessness thing, I think, points at our housing crisis more than anything else. We have a significant, severe housing crisis. Sam and I are both on the Housing Advisory Committee, and we talk about the statistics of how much gets built in the community. And we have statistics since 2014, and roughly we build about 150 houses, apartments, units, all lumped together, about 150 a year. And our population growth and our population demands about 250 units to be built every year. And so for the past, since 2014, which is when we have statistics, we fall behind by about 100 units every year. So we're in a hole behind with units of 1,000 or 2,000, depending on when that fall off started. And then we need to build 250, 300 houses, apartments, units every year, and we still build it. At the last 2 years, we built it about 170 units a year. So we're not catching up at all. So a lot of what happens with homelessness, I think, is because of our lack of housing. There are another sort of thing to point that out is that there are communities in the United States, Googled them up, communities that declare they've ended homelessness. And I don't, I'm not there. I don't know how truthful that is. But one of the things that when I looked further into that, they have vacant apartments. They have places for people to live in those communities. And then what they've done is then they've wrapped very significant social services around those people that were living in the park because of mental health issues or drug addiction. But the most significant thing that they have are rentals. They have vacancies, which we don't have.
I got so excited about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, somebody emailed me this link and they're like, "Hey, you've got to check this out. This is the Ohio model for ending homelessness for pregnant women. Like, this needs to happen. You're going to save $1 million a baby. Like, this is huge. Like, for the taxpayers, for the community." It was like, great. So I look it up and I check out their model and I get on the phone with somebody. Use healthcare dollars to rent up big blocks of cheap apartments in underpopulated neighborhoods. It was like, okay, well, we don't have those on the West Coast, but this is great for communities that have had these big exoduses of people going from one city to another. This is great in places like Detroit, parts of Chicago. This is good in Ohio, and this is a model that's happening in a lot of the country, but it's not working on the West Coast, partially because, like Doug said, we've been underdeveloping And a lot of the estimates go back to the early 2000s or to, the market crash, 2008, 2009. And that information's out there. Oregon Community Foundation worked with Echo Northwest in 2019, and they published a document called something like Ending Homelessness in Oregon. Page 24 has all the statistics on it. Portland State University does the population forecasts for all of your cities. And so you can go back, and I think the last one for Grants Pass was done in 2018. It'll show you population forecasts. And then you can look up development permits through the city's planning office. And this is what Doug's referencing. And this is all out there. And what you will see is exactly what Doug described. We've been underbuilding by about 50%. So there's a real supply and demand issue. This is a very different problem than we were looking at 10 or 15 years ago with our housing crisis then. That was this sort of crazy thing going on with prices and lending, and then people kind of getting overburdened with their costs. And now we're just in a very real situation where there's not enough units. Income hasn't kept up with cost of living. Now we also have an inflation issue, and gas is over $5 a gallon today, which doesn't make things any easier. So for our families who have decided to try and live in Selma, Cape Junction, Kirby, O'Brien, and then commute into Grants Pass, or for families who have decided to live in Grants Pass and commute down to Central Point and Medford in order to save some money, that's not working out well right now. We've got a lot of families that are right on the margin. Grants Pass is one of a dozen cities in Oregon that has such a significant population of our percentage of our population that is what they call extremely cost burdened, meaning more than half of your income is going to rent and utilities. And so you don't have wiggle room. Something happens, your kid breaks their arm, they're in trouble. Your car breaks down, you're in trouble. And this is where a lot of folks end up. And this is one of the reasons that so many people are living in their cars now. And this is another way that homelessness has changed. I think where we are now compared to where we were 10 or 15 years ago is a lot more of it is folks that had resources and still have some of them. And so there's plenty of places you can go around town and you can see people in cars and vans. It's a different type of unsheltered homelessness that we've seen in the past. And because Josephine County and Grants Pass have so few resources for places for people to go, we have a real need for family housing, which is different than communities that do have more of the traditional shelter access. So that's just part of what makes our situation a little bit different than other communities too. Yes, please.
Is there any potential within the city empty retail space for conversion for housing?
It is certainly something at the Housing Advisory Committee that we've talked about. Repeat your question.
Oh, sorry, for the folks at home, the question is there any empty retail space that could be converted for housing?
Yes, so we've started to talk about that to try to incentivize it, and it's really reliant on the owners of the retail space. Unfortunately, most of that kind of a project would be a complete tear down and then a rebuild, which means you're throwing away a building that may well be, serviceable. But I think with the right incentives, it might be worthwhile, but we haven't seen anybody willing to do it yet. And the tools the city has to incentivize that type of thing, they're not very well developed yet. This new city council has been very proactive, and they've said, let's create this bucket of tools. Some of them are incentives for developers, and some of that would be retail space being turned in. But nobody's come forward to use them yet, so they're not very well developed tools. But they are there, and the concept is there, and the willingness to use those things are there, but no one's done it yet. I do salivate a little bit at the Staples building and that whole area right there. When I think about that, it's like, that would be great. 1,000 apartments right there would be just fantastic. But somebody has to give up a $10 million building to do that, or more.
Something we were asked for at the last town hall too were some definitions of terms. One of them is pallet shelters, and you saw the picture up there, the white rigid structures or the brown rigid structures. Some people hear the term pallet shelter, and the first thing they think of is like the edges of Mumbai or something, right? It's pallets, it's tarps, it's shanty, and that's not what we're talking about. They're shipped on pallets. We really need a better word for them because this confuses people and causes some anxiety. But they're nice looking units, they're organized, they're weatherproof. This is Southern Oregon, they're gonna get hot in the summer, they're gonna get cold in the winter, but they can also be fitted with heaters and with air conditioning, and they can have solar on top to help offset those costs. And one of the really nice things is because they are portable, they can be broken down, picked up, moved. They don't need to put in the permanent infrastructure. So a site, theoretically, where we get through where we are now in this crisis period in our community, and we don't need the urban campground anymore, that site can be easily converted into something else with relatively little reinvestment. And then the other one is homeless versus transient. So we have an awful lot of people who are homeless in our community who are from our community. They went to high school here, they worked here, or they lived here quite a long time. And that is one of the things too about Road Retreat's model, is it does prioritize people who have been here for a while. And I think that goes back to a question earlier, how does some of that eligibility work? And at least at the beginning, a lot of the eligibility is going to be around folks that have been here for 6 months or longer and have residency in the community. And I thought I saw a hand coming up. Deb?
Yeah, so anybody can go. In fact, I think you would really get rewarded by going to Medford and seeing the campground, and not only the campground, but the Kelly Center, the Pallet Shelter, Hope Village, and all you need to do is call Road Retreat, and they'll make an appointment. They even have a little older van that, you just park your car and you have a tour, basically. And I think sometimes if we see what we're talking about, the fear is dissipated, or can be dissipated so much easier. So I just wanted to mention that.
And for the folks at home, the comment was that if you're interested, there's a lot of benefit to doing a tour. And then to get those tours, it would be contacting Road Retreat. Their phone number is 541-499-0880. I might call them from time to time.
Yes, you do, don't you?
It's that, my mom's birthday, and like the address that I had when I was 6. Like those are the numbers I have still. But if there's a big enough interest in the community, then we can try and arrange a van too. Road Retreat has sent vans up here before to shuttle people down if the drive is a burden.
Also, a lot of times we don't talk about things that are good, and it took a long time to get some sort of warming situation. And there was the temporary warming center, and then run by Buchanan. Those of us who volunteered, I mean, I thought it was fantastic, so needed. Well, the warming shelter that is and has been running, nobody talks about how successful it is, and it is. They haven't had any situations, and there's it's called mealtrain.com, and anybody can sign up and say, you're going to bring food over. That's what it basically is, a schedule. And each time my husband and I have done it, it's just so thankful, so appreciated. I wish there was more publicity about how Road Retreat has created something that is, can you tell I hate to talk in public?
Yeah, but yeah, you're right, and thank you for bringing that up. The two facilities in Grants Pass have been running well, and they've been no significant problems. I mean, there's been, a broken doorknob here and those kinds of things, but other than that, everything's been working well. There haven't been significant issues at all. I think the neighbors over there near the hospital, the Ramsey area, I don't think there's been any significant complaints about that. I heard one person say was somebody hanging out outside smoking, and it's like, well, that kind of happens just about anywhere there's a business. And I know Foundry, we were very involved in the creation of Foundry, and it's been running very smoothly. No issues. And they've got a very long waiting list, and they've graduated a couple people out, and so it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. Yes?
Can you mention the meal train? I think she mentioned mealtrain.com.
Yeah.
For people at home.
Yeah, so at home, a person in the audience mentioned the shelter here in town on Ramsey or Nebraska, whatever street it's on. There's a way of volunteering to provide a meal there if you're interested in doing it. They have about 25 participants there, and if you or your neighbors, your friends wanted to create, my neighbor organized it, and a couple of us created pots of chili, and we brought pots of chili and cornbread over there one night, and a salad. And so if anybody's interested in doing that, there's a site called mealtrain.com, or go to Rogue Retreat and look at the shelter and look at ways of helping the shelter. I think would be the way to find that.
Doug, how long has Foundry Village been operating now, and how has the neighborhood reacted to it now that it's been there that long?
Yeah, so it's been up and running, operational since Halloween, Thanksgiving. What was it? It was Halloween, Thanksgiving. One of those. It was right at one of the holidays. So it's whatever that is, 5 months now, 6 months, and they've had a couple graduations. They've had a couple people they exited because of inappropriate behavior. I think the neighbors are happy with it. There's been no complaints. We've certainly there were plenty of objections before, yeah. And I think once it was built and people realize it's not an eyesore, it's fenced, it's secured. The only people that are there are the people that are the participants. There aren't people coming and going. There are no services provided to anyone who isn't a participant, which sort of eliminates the need for a person to walk up to try to get something. There's nothing to get for a person. It's been functioning well, and I think I would assume all the neighbors are happy, but without talking to each one of them, I don't know. Yes, sir.
First of all, I'd like to thank you guys for taking this on.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that. It's going to be a great thing for the community.
Yeah.
And I can't help but believe that anything that's planned, organized, and managed has got to be better than no action at all. I do have I'm somewhat curious about the car camping aspect of it, and I think that's a great thing to add in. Have you thought about, when you open that up to some of those vehicles, are you also going to supply some kind of mechanical support? Because I got to tell you, I've seen some of these rigs, and they're barely operating. It'd be great if you could include, I don't know, access to a mechanic or some kind of assistance to keep those vehicles running.
Thank you for saying thank you to us, but there's really a big team doing this. It's not just us. Deb there created the slideshow, and there's a whole bunch of people with All Care, and then Rogue Retreat have been very helpful in this, and Tom and various people. So I'll pass on your thank you to all of them, because it's quite a great team. For the vehicle parking, the city has asked us if we could find a space big enough for vehicle parking. One of the complications for that is if we develop a site, we have to put in the appropriate infrastructure to meet modern standards, which means stormwater retention, curbs, gutters, pavement, that kind of stuff. So it can get expensive, so until we know what site we're on and all of that, and we develop that plan, we don't know, but the concept is to try to do that. As for mechanical services, I think Rogue Retreat does do that, and they require, go ahead if you know more than I do about that. I think they even require that the vehicles be operable.
Right. Cool. Rogue Retreat's already doing that. They've got some experience. What we like to do is we let them be the lead dog, and then we learn from the things that don't work for them.
Yeah. Yeah, but I suspect that there will need to be some jumper cables. There will need to be some jumper cables there, and probably a little starter fluid. But I believe they have you have to be operable, and I don't know what the time period is. Probably on a weekly basis. You have to prove your vehicle moves, because you can't just park it and leave it there.
Well, and that could be a great place too for somebody who had that skill and was looking to volunteer, or someone who's retired and had that skill and was looking to volunteer. And we'd certainly go to recruit that. Jen, what did you say just a second ago?
I'm sorry.
What did you say just a second ago?
Talked about Rogue Retreat.
Oh, Rogue Retreat.
Yes.
So yeah, something we didn't mention is, so Rogue Retreat's been doing this work in some capacity or another since 1998. And so that's one of the advantages that we're trying to do, is we're trying to recreate 24 years of learning and let go of 24 years of mistakes at the same time, and try and recreate what they've done, in 5 or 6 years instead of waiting 20 years to get this patched together. And it's been a really good partnership in those ways.
And just to speak to one of Deb's comments earlier, when you talk to the people from Medford, they've gone through a lot of the same struggles that we're going through now, and they're celebrating a lot of those successes. You drive down to Medford, and you see very few people in the parkways. You see in the water
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, Road Retreats Urban Campground has been in a temporary facility, used to be a slaughterhouse, and the building's still sort of there, and they're able to use the vacant land around the building, but they're leasing it. Turn that on. They're leasing it, and the city of Medford is currently trying to find them. They're actively trying to find them land and buy them land for a permanent urban campground. So they're successful enough that the city is actually putting money up, like Grants Pass is willing to do, to actually pay for a facility, pay for a site. You know, they just got to find a spot.
Yeah, the same was actually true with Hope Village that opened in 17, or started in 17, I think opened in 18. But that was initially on the city public works lot. And the city of Medford gave them a low dollar lease or a free lease, and then let them kind of start developing that, and then they kind of needed to pick up a second lot so that they could put in all of the services, the dog kennel and the garden and the shower trailer and those other things. And then really, and they'll say it over and over, it's the secret sauce of case management that makes that work.
Yeah.
And then that's one of the places where, you know, in my day job with healthcare, we really appreciate these programs because you can see where somebody comes into the program, and then when they leave, they're in a different place. Which is great, and that's one of the things that we're really looking forward to too, recognizing that a lot of there's mental health issues, there's behavioral health issues, there are drug issues with some folks, and if somebody does need drug and alcohol treatment and they go into a 90-day program, those 90-day programs are like $750 a day. Those are very expensive programs. Now they're worth it for the individual, for their family, for their life, and putting dollars and cents to it, long-term dollars and cents and taxpayer dollars, that's also worth it. Like, it's a large dollar amount up front, but it's kind of like the old idea that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that's very true here too. So why I say all of that is that if somebody is discharged from drug and alcohol treatment back to the street, the likelihood of them staying clean and sober afterwards is, depending on where you look, between 0 and 2%, and those are in the communities where you can find data. Most communities, they don't track data. They also don't usually track how often somebody may go through a program like this, because again, there's not a lot of data on success, because there's just not a lot of success in those models. What we see with these case managed programs where someone has a place to go after inpatient drug and alcohol treatment, 64% success rate. So this is night and day, huge difference. 30 some odd times the success rate. And then the case management costs are much lower. You're talking about 100 times cheaper for a month of case management than you are for a month of inpatient drug and alcohol treatment. And that's the kind of success model we'd really like to see for our families, for our businesses, for our parks, for our kids, and then God forbid anybody who's not in that situation now that ends up in that situation later, that there's a clear path out of that, and the Grants Pass has put the foresight and the energy into developing that. Because this is a program that is going to start at a moment in time, and we're going to try and address history and be there to prevent problems in the future too. And that's really kind of the aspiration and the promise of what we're looking at doing with your help. And I saw a hand going up.
I was just going to comment that I think once we get this program rolling, once we acquire a piece of land, we will get Foundry Village as an example. 2018, we were struggling with getting things through the city council and the zoning. There was a lot of objections. But then we get into it, and we probably had at least 100 different faith organizations, businesses, all kinds of different commercial activities that went together and made donations of labor and material and built tiny houses. And we had at least 350 families and individuals that gave donations to help us raise the money. 2/3 of the money for Foundry Village came from local donations, either corporate or individuals and families. That was a $650,000 bill to put Foundry Village together.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm not going to recreate that nearly as well as you said it, but for the folks at home, Foundry Village started off as kind of a scary change for the community, and then ultimately we had over 100 agencies involved and individuals in either donating time, helping to build it, and it's becoming something that the community's proud of as opposed to kind of afraid of that change, and we're hoping to carry that forward too.
What's the other service that's provided in the city of Grants Pass other than Foundry Village?
There's a shelter program over by the hospital.
Can you elaborate on that? I'm not familiar with that.
It's run in a partnership with UCAN and Row Retreat, case managed shelter for folks that are unsheltered and homeless. And then it's very similar. When they come in, they get signed up for housing programs that may be available in wait lists. And then the attempt is to connect them to other services that are available for them that they're eligible for, they may not be connected to. And then start kind of planning for what their exit is. And then we're working with Row Retreat to try and figure out how to keep that shelter open as well.
In addition,
Asking about the mission?
no, I know about the mission. What you're talking about, yeah, I guess the mission would be like a third.
Yeah.
And are there others that I'm not thinking of?
Well,
There's others too.
there's Women's Crisis Support Team has an emergency, I don't know what they call their buildings, but it's for women who are running away from abusive relationships, so that's sort of a shelter too. And then there's the
Hearts with a Mission.
Hearts with a Mission, thank you. Hearts with a Mission,
Yes.
that's for teens.
And there's a couple of programs that do like short-term hotel vouchers.
Yeah.
Illinois Valley Safe House Alliance, UCAN, All Care can help with those too.
And there's Maslow as well. Maslow
Yeah, they don't
provides
think-
services, not housing, right?
Right, they do services and
Services
housing.
for teens.
And what's the other one?
Homeless
There's
teens.
oh, and then there's the county youth facility that's also for. I'm not exactly sure how that works. I think it's sort of a bridge between foster and maybe there's a law enforcement aspect to that too.
And I apologize for being late. I actually came a couple months ago when you had one of the first meetings, and this is your last meeting
Yeah.
for this purpose.
Mhm.
So, introduce myself, Todd, I'm a community member. Served on the school board a little bit, and then had a conflict of interest with my coaching career. I'm generally opposed to this idea, but I'm here because I want to understand it more. Not oppose it more, but understand it more. Some questions I had when I was originally here that I still don't get answers to. One of which is, if someone has an outstanding warrant for their arrest, how does that get screened coming into an urban campground?
I don't know.
If
We
someone-
haven't,
yeah.
do you know how the police, I don't know if we've had conversations about that.
So if someone has an outstanding warrant for the arrest, how would that get screened coming into the campground? Most of the folks that we're going to be working with are going to have history with law enforcement, and most likely for the campground project are most likely going to come in with a law enforcement referral through the community response team.
Right.
And so they'd already be aware of that just through their engagement.
And people are, okay, so I saw that on the facts and questions here.
Yeah.
People can self-refer?
No.
Not for the campground. The campground is going to have a law enforcement referral, at least at the beginning.
Yeah, or other agencies.
Yeah.
Not just law enforcement.
Correct.
Options and the hospital maybe, or whoever, I don't know who
My
else.
other outstanding concern,
Road Retreat has an established process for reviewing all the people that are coming through there. And I believe that they do a referral through the police department on everybody that is coming, that's registering to come into their programs.
so as long as we're getting to that point, because the first meeting, it was a big, I don't know, we don't do that.
Right.
So as long as we're getting to a point where we can establish, or if it's been established, adopt those protocols to keep people safe within, probably more than from without,
Right.
is, the idea was, well, people can come here as a safe haven. We'll prove that if they aren't being screened for outstanding warrants for their arrest,
Right.
for homicide, for theft, for burglary, for murder, whatever.
Well, and that's
I know there's
no.
levels of crimes, and I understand that. I assume that the hard crimes will be screened automatically from the police department. Who's referring people to come to the urban campground?
So I think one of the, something that you're saying about the safety in the campground is really important, and that's a huge piece of all of this. Is the campground has to be safe inside and out, which is one of the reasons it's going to have 24-hour staffing. It's going to have case management. There have been a lot of conversations with law enforcement. One of the reasons we're able to better answer your questions about warrants and screening and law enforcement engagement now than we were 2 months ago is we've spent a lot more time talking to Chief Hensman and other folks both in Grants Pass Police as well as in Jackson County who've had the on-the-ground experience with the campground for the last almost 2 years.
I don't know if this is true or not, but I was pretty involved in Rover Creek when it started up with the city of Medford, and isn't anybody who comes in through the Rover Creek or any system that's actually I know Rover Creek is dialed into HMIS, and I don't know what kind of flags or referrals are in with that. But I do know that when Hope Village was started, there was a lot of evaluation on the true costs, the systemic costs to downtown business, law enforcement, the judicial system, the healthcare system, inappropriate utilization of other services that really tipped the city council, frankly, and the business owners to establish Rover Creek. And so there was an intense partnership between the Medford PD, who was, frankly, the police department is a 24-hour social service organization, and they do a lot beyond law enforcement, and that cost was so significant that they were advocating for the establishment of Rover Creek. But I do believe that those referral loops and the data sources are more sophisticated than what you might think of when you think of an urban campground that would kind of catch and flag, people who may not be appropriate for that type of environment.
No, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, and so for the folks at home, part of that was about the referral tools that agencies that traditionally work with the homeless population will use. And there's a tool called HMIS, the Homeless Management Information Service or System. And it's HUD-funded agencies use this in partnership with law enforcement and then other action agencies. So you've got Maslow, who is our local McKinney-Vento partner. They do a lot of homeless youth outreach programs to the schools in particular, and they're really working with kids and families or households that have kids under 24. So you've got 0 to 18 is youth, and then 18 to 24 is transition age youth, and then you've got households that have youth or transition age youth. And then you've got your continuum of care, and our local agency for that is UCAN. And then UCAN is using the HMIS tool to screen, track, and also make referrals. And then a lot of that's happening in partnership with Maslow, with law enforcement, and with other agencies. And so there's a lot of information in that system. I don't have access to that system, so I can't say how that would show up. I know that there's safeties in there for people's privacy. So for example, if somebody is escaping domestic violence, then that information doesn't necessarily show up in the system to protect that person potentially from their abuser who may have access to that system somewhere else in the community. So a lot of safety is built into it. One of the reasons I don't have access to it is that I don't need access to it, and that's usually how information works, is unless you've got a really good reason to access that data, you don't get to. So my side of that is all with HIPAA, with the schools, it's FERPA, all of the fun acronyms we try not to throw. I don't even know what FERPA stands for, I'll admit that. But yeah, all of the acronyms we kind of throw at the problem. But the nice thing is, if you're looking at somebody's history, the likelihood of violence or other problems, and if you're looking at safety, both for the folks that are in the community, in the residential program, whether that's the campground or Foundry Village or elsewhere, you're also looking at the safety of those people from the outside, and also the safety of their neighbors. So it's a whole community thing.
So speaking of which, would something in Road Retreat that's established, how long have they been going, 5, 6 years?
Road Retreat, 1998.
Okay. But we've, on the Bear Creek,
The urban campground,
Oh,
2 years.
Yeah.
just 2 years.
Yeah.
Do they keep firearms out? Is that something that's a part of the process of just
Yeah, what they have there is
Off limits,
they have a site where they have lockers. Anybody brings in anything, a weapon of some sort, has to turn it in and lock it up.
personal property.
Yeah. Now, I'm not sure about handguns, whether a person would have, I would suspect not because they're just too valuable. You could pawn a handgun for a couple $100 and keep a baseball bat with you. When I've been down there, what I've seen is a baseball bat and things like that. So I think that's what a homeless person tends to have with them when they're living in the bushes or living on the streets. So I'm not sure about the handgun thing. But they have lockers. They're supposed to turn everything in when they come.
So that's the whole safety factor. I guess the other thing that was a couple months ago, we were still kind of, don't know, that maybe you've come further than that since then, and that is the idea, it's a myth that this is going to replace, or people are going to move out of the parks and go here. I'm an avid tennis player, and I'm practically friends with the homeless population at Gilbert Creek, just up the street here. And for the most part, no issues. It's an eyesore. The vehicles that are stranded, broke down, people are in a bad place, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, some of those people may or may not get referred to an urban campground. The myth is, oh, well, this is going to take people out of the parks and make more of an established catch-all area. That is not the case, correct?
So the question is whether or not the campground would get everybody out of the parks.
Or half of everybody, or whatever.
Well, he's clearly demonstrated in Bedford that a lot of people have moved out of the parks, out of the creeks, into the urban campgrounds, and they've gone to the urban campground. Will all of them move? No. There's a law enforcement issue that right now Grants Pass has their hands tied because they have no alternative except the parks.
And we're looking for a capacity of what in an urban campground, given that?
The capacity that Rogue Retreat says they can handle with 2 staff 24 hours a day is 70 sites, which would be theoretically, if there were a couple in every site, be 140.
So a minimum of 70 up to,
Yeah,
an average of.
yeah, yeah. And they've said that to include the camping or the vehicle parking as well. So that would be a mixture of the two. I suspect that that's what they can handle that need case management. I think that if we could find a way to create some parking where high-functioning people can park, we could probably try to find a way of doing that where they don't need case management. They just need a place to park because they can't.
Is the parking to accommodate the vehicle or them to sleep in their vehicle? I guess it could be both, right?
Both, yeah.
Yeah, and the way that so there's some rules. Oregon passed some safe parking rules a couple of years ago, and most cities have adopted them. And so the rules with that is it has to be a safe place to park a car. It's usually a pretty limited number of cars unless you're establishing a new camp, which this could be, or this would be. And then there need to be restroom facilities. I think that's pretty much it, and there needs to be some sort of site safety. And so that's something you could do in scattered sites up to about 3 units, I think, or 3 parking spaces.
Yeah.
And so anything like a campground or, well, even Foundry Village, it's going to have a parking requirement, both for staff but also for guests. And then one of the things we run into is that the longer somebody is stable, the longer they're stabilized, the more income they have, the easier it is to seek, keep, or advance their employment. And then the more likely they are to get a vehicle if they don't already have one, or get a running vehicle. And so we know that when people come into a program, the longer they're there, the more vehicles we end up having on site. And so that'll have to be factored in too.
So that 60% success rate means folks like that improve would eventually move on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that the 60% you're talking about? They would literally move on, correct?
Correct. Move on, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's no Rogue Retreat doesn't define what move on means, because for some people that's really successful, and for some it's permanent managed housing where they get care constantly. So everybody has a different.
With a relative, that'd be considered moving on.
Correct. Right. Correct.
Everything would be beyond living in an urban campground in a poverty-stricken way.
Correct.
So to speak.
Yeah.
Anything moving up and beyond that
Right.
would be considered a success.
They have to be sober for 2 years. So yeah, they have really high staffing requirements.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little,
I guess that is a form of vetting.
yeah, it's a little, it's a good thing and a bad thing, because the shelter here in town, over near the hospital, had the ability to open many, many, many months ago, but Rogue Retreat has such high standards for their staffing, they couldn't find anybody to staff it. So they had a real hard time hiring people to staff that because of their clean and sober standards.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting model. It does make it harder for them to hire, but the other side of this is it allows them to hire folks that were formerly homeless.
Yeah.
And this means that you've got people who are really, really well informed in what the issues are, who are helping to define service, helping to run case management. It's not theory. They're not coming out of college with a bunch of good ideas, which, go to college, that's great. But they're coming in with real practical experience on how this works and what worked for them. But they want to make sure that that person's stable enough that they're not going to get triggered by their working environment, and they're not going to trigger somebody else to potentially relapse. And I really appreciate the high standard that Rogue Retreat holds himself to.
Yeah.
And that's part of their success model.
That creates trust, right?
Yeah, and it does create trust.
It's vice versa, all combined, that somebody who is staying in the campground probably doesn't trust real easily, and somebody who's working there has to learn how to trust that person.
Yeah.
The other thing is that, I forget what it was going to, anyway.
We're still in a dilemma of trying to find an ideal location, correct?
Yeah.
A suitable location.
Yeah.
A suitable location, yes.
Yeah, that's the biggest issue.
Finding the right location is going to be difficult. And anywhere that we do look, there's going to be, just like anything else, drawbacks. The same is true when you picked your home or where you picked your career. There's pros and cons to every decision, and we're going to run into the same thing with any site that we end up trying to pursue.
Yeah, and it's going to be near somebody, and it's, that's the nature of it, and people will resist that when it's near them, and we understand that.
Thanks for the clarification and improvement from 2 months ago.
We tried to do our research, thank you. Oh, and you'd asked another question I don't think we answered about helping people move out of the parks, part of the role of the campground in that.
Yeah.
And depending on which point in time count we look at, and recognizing the last point in time count where they do a physical count of people who are homeless in a community on a single day in January, it's around 1,500 people, 1,000 to 1,500 people for the whole county. Is a census. And we're not going to be able to address all of those people's needs at the campground, at least not all at one time, for lots of reasons. Some people are not going to be, physically capable of staying there. They need to be probably more like a nursing home. Some folks aren't going to meet some of the other eligibility criteria we talked about. They may not be safe in the campground for different reasons. And then the other piece of this is an invitation. So the campground is there for folks who'd like to use it, similar to how Foundry Village is there for folks who'd like to use it. And there was a little bit of a slow uptick at first. The first couple of weeks, there weren't a lot of people there. And now we've got a wait list. And we anticipate the camp will be the same thing. Once the camp is opened, if you judge the camp's success on its day one occupancy, it'll look like a failure. It'll probably look like a failure on the second week. But then once it's open, like you said, trust, once word gets around, and once the model is better understood by the intended users of the campground, we figure that it'll be in the same place, it'll be full, and it'll have a wait list. And we'll have success stories of people who have gone from the campground into Foundry Village, but it still won't be it's not incarceration, it's not jail, it's not gonna take the place of people are still gonna have their choices to make. And we're hoping that this, for most people, looks like an attractive choice, looks like the right choice, and that they want to take those steps out. But similarly, we don't really want folks in there who aren't ready to make those choices for themselves yet, because that will be distracting for the folks that are trying to take those steps out.
So you don't want people in there for what?
We don't want people in there who aren't ready to make progress. I mean, we do. We want them to make that choice. We want them to be ready to make progress. But if they're not ready to come in, they're not ready to use the service, we'd rather help them when they're ready than try and force them. And that's just
According to raw numbers,
I'm not sure.
I know, I've seen that published a couple of times. I know
Okay.
there's a big gap between that one and the point in time survey.
Yeah, I don't remember where the number came from, if it was Warren or somebody, it was 30 to 50 vehicles in town that people live in.
And some of the homeless numbers are really difficult because different agencies use a different standard for evaluating homelessness. So a lot of times a number might be talking specifically about like unsheltered homeless people in the parks that are visible. Other numbers will talk about kids who are in unstable living situations. And I know something that's really confused some of our policymakers or frustrated some of our policymakers is when you have a childhood homelessness rate that's higher than the overall homelessness rate. And that would seem illogical, except that they look at likely outcomes with homeless kids. So if you're unstable, you're couch surfing, you're tripled up in a room that's really designed for one person, those are going to impact your ability to be stable in school, your ability to thrive and be successful, your ability to not become homeless later as an adult. Yeah, and so the numbers are all over the place depending on what agency you look at. And so we usually try and stick to the standard point in time number because that's what HUD likes. And then usually we use those numbers because generally speaking, agencies are looking for HUD funding. We actually don't have any plans to pursue HUD funding for this project, unless we can later.
The person has to come to the facility, like it's been held at the fairgrounds, so it's not a matter of knowing how many people are out there. It's up to a person to come there, and usually when I volunteered there, the kind of catalyst were their portable showers. And so, plus there are charities there that have collected clothing and there's food, and so there's sort of a give and a take. But a lot of people just don't go there.
There'd be a commitment somewhat for people to come, if they're registered to come in, or is it just come and leave as you please?
There'll be a commitment to being case managed, to using the space. If people are coming and they're signed up, but they don't follow through, they don't use their space, we're not going to hold a space empty for a long time for someone. We want to have that space utilized because we've got a big enough need in the community that we want that to go to folks who can use it. But we want to be reasonable about that too. So if somebody is doing shift work, or if somebody's maybe going to go visit family for a couple of days and try and reestablish those relationships, then let's absolutely support that person and keep their unit open for them for a couple of days so that they can go try and build a connection back with mom and dad or their kids or whoever it is that they're trying to reconnect with.
Yeah, Road Retreat, I don't remember what it was, but they had talked about that very issue, and they've found the balance between saying you got to be here doing things, and yet you still have some space to go do your own thing as an individual, like see family or go camping or do whatever.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons we really like the case managed model where people are signed up as opposed to a drop-in is one of the things we ran into even with the shelter was if you've got a hard 9 o'clock, you got to be in by 9 or the door is closed and it's locked, then people have to choose sometimes between their job and their bed.
Yeah.
And that's not what we're trying to accomplish. Like we want to make this easy for someone's life and their lifestyle. Assuming that lifestyle is kind of going in the direction the program's intended.
Yeah, the other thing that happened with the shelter when it was at the old DMV building, it was drop-in, no reservations, no commitments, and so people would congregate outside ahead of time, making sure they would get a bed, and that was one of the significant negatives about that whole thing was that was a real bother for the businesses in that area, was just having a good dozen or so people just hanging around waiting for it to open at whatever time it opened, 4 or 5.
Yeah, and it was competitive because there were only 40 units, 40 beds.
Yeah.
And we had more than 40 people who wanted to use them, and so people were incentivized basically to come early and compete for a bed, which is not what we wanted to see. And so we're going to learn from that lesson. And then the other one is it was only open for about 12 hours, 11 or 12 hours.
Yeah, it was evening. Yeah.
And so then folks were kicked out in the morning, for another 12, 14 hours, and then they could come back at night. But where are you going to go? Especially if you are incentivized to come back and wait in line again, so it makes sense to kind of hang out near the building, which created a new problem. And the nice thing is we're going to avoid those problems by running a 24/7 program that doesn't kick people out, doesn't encourage that kind of like lining up, and then registration won't be on that site anyway, and so there really won't be any reason to go to that site unless you live there. And of course, we'll have people who want to come take tours and other things.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things we didn't mention, although we've talked around it quite a bit, is that we tend to use the word homeless, and we talk about a whole bunch of people with a whole bunch of different needs and stories, and the homeless are as more different than everybody who's in this room, even, where you've got a lot of reasons people have become homeless. You've got a lot of different stories behind their life. People have different needs and barriers, and widely different age ranges. And a lot of people, one of the reasons that the numbers are so different is a lot of people don't want you to know that they're homeless. It's kind of a dirty word. If somebody goes to apply for a job and they write homeless down as their address, nobody's going to read past their address for the most part. There's very few employers in town who are going to be willing to take that risk on somebody, and it's just true. So a lot of people really try hard to pretend like they're not. And there's a lot of reasons for this. People are concerned about what happens with their relationship with their kids. They want to demonstrate that they're good parents. They don't necessarily want you to know that they're homeless and trying to raise their kids. They want to keep their kids. They want to get through this problem. Senior citizens, and in particular women, from the interviews that we've done, don't want to get victimized. And this makes perfect sense. You're vulnerable if you're sleeping outside at night. And so the numbers tend to be all over the place because a lot of the people who are in some of the most dire needs of support are hiding. They're passing as best as they can so that they don't appear to be homeless. And we did a series of interviews back in 2017, 2018. And I meant to bring the cards tonight, but I can email out to anybody later the links. To some of those stories, and we're getting ready to redo those interviews to find out who's in town, what their needs are, what their stories are, and then how they would like their needs best addressed.
Well, thanks for your...
One other thing that I wanted to mention when you talked about safety, that they have shelters and mentioning lockers. It's not only for people outside, but within the community, like having documents is really, really important. And they get stolen, right? Or, yeah, constantly, yeah. And, or you have a cell phone. I can't tell you how many times the stepson's phone was taken. I mean, amongst themselves, they need protection as well. So, so that things run smoothly, so that they can have a modicum of security. So it's good that there's, that they're protected. I mean that there's the ability to have if it's a birth certificate, for example, that they can lock it up. And, it's huge.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap up here. Any other last questions or anything? Yes, sir.
Based on the referrals, so we know arresting the problem will not go away. We know that when law enforcement does go through the parking line, some people do have warrants and do go to jail. So my question is, if they do get a self-referral from law enforcement at that point, go to jail, how long is the referral good for so that when they exit the jail, they can still have a chance to come into the urban campground?
I don't know. I've never heard anybody talk about that. Good question.
I love that question. The question is, if somebody does end up going to jail because they get a law enforcement referral and they have a warrant, what is the referral process from jail into one of these programs?
Yeah.
Well, and how long would the referral be good for?
Right.
I would say that so my assumption on that is that the referral itself doesn't have a clock on it.
It doesn't have an expiration, yeah.
But there's a program here in town called Welcome Home Oregon that's designed to find housing for people who are exiting incarceration that don't have a place to go. And so we would want to make sure that we're working with Welcome Home Oregon as part of their referral strategy for placing people into housing in the community. Unfortunately, Doug and I both work with that program in different ways. Yes, please.
Welcome Home Oregon is for prison.
Yeah, parolees.
We like the local, you know, they just sort of go to jail for the day for like, you know, a local warrant.
Oh, okay, so
Not,
really,
not quite the same thing.
No, they're
That's kind of how you mean
when
it.
they're coming out of prison.
okay, so coming out of local jail versus coming out of prison. That's a really good conversation for us to have with the sheriff's department. Thank you.
Yeah, and parole and probation, I would guess.
Mm.
Because a lot of them, their warrant is like basically trespassing for staying somewhere they weren't supposed to. You know what I mean? And so they'll just pick them up and they'll turn around and like release them, so
Right.
what that patrol looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll have to ask, we'll have to start to have that conversation. I'm assuming Road Retreat has been down that path, and they've worked that out and found a way of dealing with that and making it work. But it's never a conversation we've had with them or heard them talk about, so don't know how to answer the question.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Tom, thank you for letting us be here.